So, despite the fact that the slave trade ends at the beginning of the 19th century in 1807, slavery is probably the biggest single factor in determining kind of what happens in American history during the 19th century. In the first half of the century, tension is kind of building between North and South over slavery. In the North, and in parts of the South, or among some people in the South, there is this movement, this abolitionist movement, which is dedicated to ending slavery growing. So you've got religious groups like the Quakers, you have kind of writers and activists like a former slave named Frederick Douglass, who writes about his experience and becomes an anti-slavery advocate, and a white newspaper editor named William Lloyd Garrison, who publishes anti-slavery editorials or speaking out. You have writers like Harriet Beecher Stowe, who wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin and sort of shocked a lot of Northerners with the horror of slavery. And then people were sort of overtly resisting slavery and trying to get slaves out of slavery. Most famously, people like Harriet Tubman and the people who ran the Underground Railroad, guiding slaves to freedom. So all of that's going on in the North. In the South, there's also resistance, both nonviolent resistance, like slaves just sort of refusing to work or working slowly, doing anything they can to sort of cheat their masters, and also violent resistance. In 1831, a slave named Nat Turner leads a rebellion where 55 white people are killed. It's the bloodiest slave rebellion in U.S. history. And about 30 years later, a white preacher named John Brown leads a mixed race group of rebels in another rebellion at Harper's Ferry, Virginia, and kills a bunch of people before he is captured and executed. There's a song about him you might know. It has nothing to do with what he actually did. It just uses his name. Talks about him moldering in the grave. But anyhow, stuff like this is really striking fear into the hearts of white slave owners in the South. And they were really afraid of a full-scale revolution like the one that happened in Haiti in 1804, the one that led to France having to sell the Louisiana Territory to the U.S. to pay off its debts from the war. So this fear fuels racism, and it also fuels increasingly harsh anti-slavery laws, like the Fugitive Slave Act, which basically required northern states where slavery was illegal, even though it was illegal, they had to return runaway slaves to the South. So this made the job of people on the Underground Railroad getting slaves smuggled to freedom even harder, because they had to get all the way to Canada in order to really be guaranteed their freedom. So in 1860, this guy named Abraham Lincoln, you might know him from the $1 bill, is elected. And he's a guy from the North, he's from Illinois, and he tolerates slavery, but he's open about the fact that he hates it. And after he gets elected, South Carolina and a bunch of other states follow suit, secede from the United States. They quit, they leave, and they form their own country called the Confederacy. And Abraham Lincoln declares war on these rebel states. It's the Civil War. And the Civil War begins in 1861. At the beginning, the North is expected to win because it has all these advantages. It has a much bigger population, it has more money, more factories to make weapons than the South does. But the South has good generals, and it's on its home turf, and it's managing to sort of hold its own. In 1863, Lincoln issues the Emancipation Proclamation, a speech where he declares that the slaves in the South are free, and he urges them to join the North. And his motivations are a little complicated. Some say that he did this because, he was driven by moral conviction that slavery is wrong. Other people kind of argue that this was a strategy to win the war, to weaken the South by taking away its slaves and having them fight for the North. And the whole meaning and the cause of the Civil War is complicated, and there's a lot of perspectives. There's a lot of debate. Was it a war to end slavery? Was it a war to preserve the Union, which is what Lincoln said it was? Was it about states' rights, which is what a lot of Southerners said then, and some still say today? Was it to protect the kind of economic interests of the country by not having it split apart, which is what a lot of historians have argued? So there's a lot of perspectives. What's pretty clear, though, is that it was by far the worst war the United States had ever had, and you could argue to this day has ever had. It killed more Americans, 750,000 is the latest estimate, which is 1 in 10 men of military age. Anyhow, that's more Americans than all the other wars the U.S. has been involved in put together. It ends with the North victorious in 1865. They surrender at Appomattox, Virginia, and 6 days later, President Lincoln is shot and killed by an assassin. So, for the abolitionists, the war ends on this high note. We won, no more slavery, but also kind of the greatest leader and figurehead of the abolition movement, the President Lincoln, is dead. And this sort of gives you an idea of the division that there must have been in the country and the sort of wounds between citizens, who had fought against each other that would have to heal. So the second half of this story is kind of the story of the healing process, and I would argue things still haven't entirely healed. It doesn't go so well. So this era after the Civil War is often known as Reconstruction. It's about a 12-year period from 1865 to 1877. And during this time, the North basically occupies the South and enforces laws that are designed to transition the South away from slavery and toward incorporating black people into society. The kind of biggest thing that happens during this early period of Reconstruction are these 3 amendments, these 3 additions to the Constitution. The 13th Amendment, which says slavery is illegal. The 14th Amendment, which says slaves are citizens. And the 15th Amendment, which sort of clarifies that, by citizens we mean slaves have the right to vote. So these 3 amendments come along in the first 10 years after the Civil War. And for a brief time, looks like things maybe are gonna go well for the former slaves. A lot of them are voting. In some states, they even get elected to state legislature. There are schools and kind of community organizations set up. Like, slaves are really psyched to be citizens. But these gains in equality, which are really huge on paper, are pretty quickly destroyed at sort of the end of the 1860s as the radical Reconstruction period ends and the Jim Crow era begins. So Jim Crow is this term for the segregation era that lasts from basically from the end of the Civil War to 1965 with the passage of the Voting Rights Act. So another 100 years. And the name Jim Crow comes from this form of kind of racist musical sketch comedy called The Minstrel Show that was popular around that time. And Jim Crow was kind of a racist character from that minstrel tradition. But the Jim Crow era was the time of segregation, of black people being technically free, but really not having the rights of citizens, and in many ways being treated with as much brutality and as much racism as they were during slavery. During the Jim Crow period, the South found ways to essentially make slavery legal, but, not call it slavery. And this allowed white business owners, former slave holders, to still make tremendous profits off of free labor of black people. So one way of doing this was debt peonage, which was a system where white people, was a system where people, both black and white, but largely black, who owed money had to work without getting paid, essentially being slaves. And so anyone who went into debt could basically be enslaved. And the most prevalent example of this was the sharecropping system, where the plantation owners, who used to own slaves, would rent land to poor white farmers and to former slaves, and would basically have it rigged so that the interest on the loan of the land was so high that they would need to work for the rest of their lives to pay it off. They also, in the South, passed these laws known as the Black Codes, which were designed to convict black men mostly for breaking these minor laws and send them to hard labor. And this created the convict leasing system, which was this practice of renting prisoners out to do really dangerous and terrible work for no pay because they're prisoners. Again, like essentially slaves. And some historians have argued actually that conditions for these prisoners were worse than slavery, because with slaves, at least, you had an investment in the slave. You owned them. They were worth something. Prisoners were a dime a dozen. All you had to do was convict another black person. You could replace one who had died. So, for all of these reasons, most historians today agree that despite the fact that slavery ends in 1865, the federal government of the United States ultimately didn't protect the rights of black people in the South under the Constitution. They maybe tried. The kind of last gasp was the Civil Rights Act of 1875, which tried to give the federal government the authority to intervene in cases where Southern laws were violating rights, but it really never got enforced. And in 1883, it was sort of deemed too divisive, and it was repealed. And the sort of nail in the coffin of the the attempt during Reconstruction to make the South a more just place happens in 1896, and it's this Supreme Court case called Plessy versus Ferguson, where a black man, Homer Plessy, tries to sit in a segregated, whites-only section of a train, gets arrested, appeals his way up to the Supreme Court, and argues, segregation is unequal. It violates, the 14th Amendment, which says that the black people have equal rights of citizenship. And the Supreme Court rules in favor of the train company that had the guy arrested, and says that segregation was constitutional. It was legal, as long as it was equal. There's nothing wrong with being separate as long as things are equal. And in their view, there was nothing unequal about it. So this part of the story ends on kind of a downer, right? There's a challenge to the Jim Crow, the segregation system that replaces slavery, that in a lot of ways is worse than slavery, and it gets all the way to the Supreme Court, and then ultimately the government sides.